This is week 4 of this current message series called Pure, Unspoiled Religion. It's a series that, as I've said over the last couple of weeks, based on the theme from the letter of James. That was our second reading, is our second reading during these weeks. The first week, James told us that pure, unspoiled religion is this: coming to the help of orphans and widows when they need it, and keeping oneself uncontaminated by the world. Over these 4 weeks, we've also been reminded through the prophet Isaiah that the Messiah would bring hope and life to those afflicted because of his presence amongst us. Isaiah tells us, your God is coming. He is coming to save you. And he tells us that there will be signs that the Messiah is visible, that he is here. He says, the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unsealed. The lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongues of the dumb will sing for joy. But sadly, in our world where we expect instant responses or satisfaction to our every request, a world where science claims to have the answer to all of or many of life's questions, where AI can now write a story about us without us even knowing it's being told, belief in a God who can save us, a God who continues to be present amongst us, is now thought by many to be nonsensical and without any proof. Even the thought that people might be prepared to give up worldly ambitions to follow that belief is beyond the comprehension of many. So where do we stand in this journey? How do we personally answer the question that Jesus put to his disciples last weekend, when he asked them, who do you say I am? I suspect that many of us would be able to answer quite easily in the same words that Peter used. You are the Christ. But what does that really look like as we live out our daily lives? Would people be easily able to see in how we live, in what we support, that we have renounced the ways of the world, and we've taken up our cross to follow Jesus? The challenge is that we don't fall into the trap that James told us that many fall into. People who simply pay lip service to what God has called us to do. James says to us, we are to accept and submit to the word which has been planted in you and which can save your souls. But he says you must do what the word tells you and not just listen to it and deceive yourselves. This weekend, in our first reading from the Book of Wisdom, we are warned about what happens when the godless of the world seek to destroy the lives of God's people. Why do they do it? Because they can. Because the person of God annoys us and opposes our way of life, reproaches us for our breaches of the law, and accuses us of playing false to our upbringing. This is what James has been warning us about in this letter. You must do what the word tells you and not just listen to it and deceive yourselves. James is telling us the Book of Wisdom is challenging us to look at what happens when we exist in the midst of the world without a firm foundation. What will happen to us? The Book of Wisdom tells us that they're going to test the Messiah, test us, with cruelty and torture. We're going to explore this gentleness of his, they say. We're going to put his endurance to the test. Let's condemn him to a shameful death, since he will be looked after. And then it has those real tragic words, because he has told us. Because we stand for something, the world, quite rightly or quite wrongly, they would believe that it's okay to challenge us and to denounce us or denigrate what's going on. Now we know that's not just a present era. Down through the ages we've had countless millions of men and women of faith who have been put to the test because either the leaders of the community do not believe that their goodness is real, or they're looking for ways to stop them. Many of these women and men are now called saints of the church, but they're not the only ones who, by their lives, despite the challenges they face, have made God's love real to others. We know that many of them actually, rather than denouncing the people who are torturing them, have actually asked God to forgive them and give them new life. On other occasions, these men and women of faith have been subjected to all kinds of rejection. Matthew's Gospel calls it calumny because of jealousy. And James reminds us today that this is one of the things that destroys communities, it destroys God's people, and it even destroys families. He tells us that there's harmony because of jealousy and ambition, then the message of the good news will not be heard by the community. But he tells us there's something else that God has given us, and that's the wisdom of God, the wisdom which is beyond all our understanding. James tells us today that the wisdom that comes down from heaven is essentially something pure. It makes for peace that is kindly and considerate. It's full of compassion and shows itself by doing good. And nor is there any trace or partiality or hypocrisy in it. There's something special about it. Now, one of the things that can happen is that we can confuse disharmony and disunity with disagreement. I have to tell you that I disagree with a lot of people, and I'm passionate when I disagree. But it doesn't mean to say that there's disunity or disharmony because of my passion. And it's not just about Geelong. There is a sense of saying, I can have an argument with somebody and still walk away as a friend. And that's the difference between disagreement and disharmony. Disharmony is when we don't work together in any way, shape or form, but have completely opposing views and refuse to accept that the other person is a son or daughter of God, our brother or sister. And so today, as we listen to the gospel passage, we hear what the book of wisdom was talking about was going to happen to the Messiah. Not disharmony, not disunity, not disagreement, but actually trying to ferment disharmony and disunity as they seek to destroy him. Jesus tells them that the Son of God will be delivered into the hands of men and they will put him to death. But then he tells them 3 days later he will be raised from the dead. Now, the disciples knew the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and some of the other prophets, Micah, trying to get their heads around this new teaching would not have been easy because their friend is sitting there telling them, I'm going to die. So Mark tells us they did not understand what he said and were afraid to ask him. I don't know about you, it's one of the challenges of being a listener is that when you're listening to somebody talking about some particular thing, a conversation that either you don't understand fully or you've got a particular point of view, my mind starts to wander and starts to have the answer to the question that somebody's raised or a different position that I'm ready to throw into the conversation as soon as they take a breath. I'm not hearing as what's being said. I'm not sure what was happening in the minds of the disciples as they were listening to Jesus, but it was obvious they had gone off on a tangent. They were now wondering if Jesus is put to death, who's going to be in charge? There's going to be a power vacuum, and we can't just let that happen. We need to keep some form of unity. They needed a backup plan. When Jesus talks to them, he challenges them to think, don't go into the ways of the world to find the solutions to your questions. So look at what I've taught you. So he calls a child into their midst. And we know that children were almost non-entities in the society. Until they were an adult, they had no real value. They were just there. So Jesus sits a child in front of them and says, unless you become like one of these little children, you cannot be my disciple. And then he says, if you welcome a a child in my name, you welcome me, but you also welcome the one who sent me. So he's looking at them and saying, don't work from the principles of the world. Don't work and look at what's happening around you and say that the world has the answers. The world has disunity and disharmony as part of its normal makeup. The only way to change that is to approach it from a totally different way of life, a totally different way of thinking. And he suggests that it's the way of the child. Now, in the parish this weekend, we celebrate First Communion, and there are 20 young people who will receive communion a little later this morning at Mass at Christ the Priest. They're making a journey towards their understanding of what it means to be a fully initiated member of the faith community. Now, that's a challenge in our world today because the amount of support that they necessarily get may not be sufficient to actually let them take the next steps. What does it mean to be fully involved in the community? Now, the only way that that really happens is when the community becomes involved with them, supports them, and encourages them. Now, obviously, the family play an incredible part in that, but the whole community needs to be part of it. So I'd like to pray that as we journey with these young children today, but also into the future, that we might remember that we are a community of God's people. And being a community, everyone is important. Which reminds us that there are some people who are missing today and people who have been missing for some weeks. What do we do to find them and to find out how they are and to find out what we can do for them? Obviously, it needs us to consider that and work to make that real. The apostles didn't understand everything that Jesus told them. We don't understand everything that is asked of us. But what we do know is that we're all, as I said, on this journey. And the journey only makes sense in a Christian context if we walk with Christ and with one another, and thus make a difference in our world.